Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Today's webinar is presented by the Best Friends Network. Specifically, our legislative advocacy team is going to be speaking today. Please put any questions that you have for the panelists in the Q&A section specifically. I'll show you on the next slide how that differs from the chat. You might see us remind people in the chat as we go. Please just make sure all questions are going in the Q&A. That ensures that the hosts are going to be able to see it and answer it. As the moderator, who is Arin, asks questions, I will be putting those questions in the chat. That's just so that you can reference what question we're on. If people have to leave for a minute and come back, or if people are joining late, they can see what topic we're discussing. We love getting people's feedback, so if you could please take literally 2 seconds at the end of the webinar to answer our single question survey, that would be great. If you have any extended feedback that you want to share with us, you can always email bfnetwork@bestfriends.org. And as always, webinar recording will be available early next week. So here's the different Zoom features that we have today. The webinar chat box you can see on the left. The blue circle is showing that you want to be sure you are chatting the right group of people. So you can toggle on different groups. If you're having a tech issue or there's something going on that you want to let the hosts and panelists know about, you can change that from everyone to hosts and panelists. So just make sure that's on the setting that you want it to be on. Q&A on the other side, like I said, it's a different section. Make sure all your questions are going in there. And then if you want to turn captions on or off, you can do that by hitting the hide captions or turn them on button down at the bottom. And again, if you have any specific questions about content, you can email legislative@bestfriends.org. Any general feedback about webinars, you can email the network. Either way, we'll get it to the right person. So with that, I will hand things off to Arin.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you all for being here today. We are super excited to be here with you for There's No Place Like Home, How to Advocate for Pet Inclusive Housing. I'm Arin Greenwood. I'm a senior strategist for Best Friends. We have so much good stuff for you here today, thanks to these three incredible panelists who are here with me right now. Shannon Glenn is executive director of My Pit Bull is Family, where she's spent well over a decade, maybe going into 2 decades now, maybe 15 years now, who can say, in the pet inclusive housing space. We've got Jamie Blackburn, the housing policy specialist for the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And Jamie has some very good news to share today that I'm super excited for you to hear about. Best Friends' own Kathleen Murphy has a new job title from when we sent the invitations out for this webinar. She is now a senior strategist on the advocacy team, and she is also a former Metro Nashville congresswoman. So she's bringing a lot of really great experience here to this webinar. Thank you all for being here. Shannon, I'm going to start with you. My Pit Bull is Family keeps the nation's largest housing database of pet-friendly rentals. Tell me about why you have this database and what it's taught you about what pet inclusive housing is like in this country and why there's a need for advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So our database started way back in 2011. So we've been doing this work for quite a long time. Our housing database right now has just over 12,475 listings that our volunteers have collected data on. And through that data, we've discovered that only 8% of those rentals are actually dog inclusive. So meaning that they don't have any breed or weight restrictions. And so, yeah, 92% of rentals across the country discriminate based on type of dog. And so we know that that's really creating problems for families across the country and when they're looking for somewhere to live. Not everyone is able to purchase a home. A lot of people rent. And, if we didn't have breed and weight restrictions in apartments, we would have more people adopting and having a place to call home.
Why is this such a persistent problem? You've had the database for 15 years now. Why do we still need the database?
We still have thousands of people searching the database all of the time to look for a place to live. Oftentimes apartments are not listing their full policies on their websites. And so we are a one-stop shop for families that are searching for a place to live. But housing continues to be a topic that we talk about in this field. And it ebbs and flows depending on what the political climate is. But we always will say, like, housing is the number one reason why pets are surrendered, and it has to be front of mind for everyone.
So that's why it's so important for people in animal welfare to get involved with this issue, right? Because it's not
Absolutely.
just that housing is an issue for people, it's that then shelters end up with the loved pets of people who can't find a place to live with their family members.
Absolutely. It's not that families just want to, surrender their pets. It's literally that they cannot find a place to call home for their entire family, and they have to make really, really difficult decisions. And so families are faced with that choice of finding a place to live or surrendering their family pet that they may have loved their entire life. And it's really devastating.
Yeah, it's really devastating and it has ripple effects throughout the whole society and throughout this industry. Um, but you with a coalition of like-minded organizations are working on an ordinance to change the situation for renters in Minneapolis. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for a very long time, we have introduced legislation on a statewide level to remove breed and weight restrictions. We passed legislation to remove breed and weight in homeowners insurance a couple years ago, which is really fantastic. However, because we haven't been successful at the state level, we're now looking on city level. And so we have been working on a city ordinance for the city of Minneapolis to remove breed and weight restrictions in apartments across the city. And that is a conversation that is still happening. There may have been some large events happening here in Minneapolis in the last few months, but housing is front of mind right now with families who are facing eviction due to being impacted by ICE. And so how can we have those conversations around making sure families can keep a place to live when they have a pet? So those conversations are definitely still happening. We've been working with our municipal animal control here in Minneapolis. We've also been working with the ASPCA and Best Friends to make sure that we can get this language passed. And we have some really great council members that are really passionate about it, and we hope to see it pass this year.
I really hope it does. And I think I feel like one of the lessons that always comes up in these webinars is just the importance of not giving up and the importance of resiliency. So you try it at the state level and face some obstacles. And so you say, okay, well, what can we do next? And is that your approach to this?
Absolutely. It's all about relationship building. I mean, our insurance bill took me 7 years to get passed, right? So it's not just a one and done, oh, we're never going to do this again, but it's about how you have those constant conversations with the people in the room and making sure that you're putting yourself in those rooms to have those conversations.
Yeah, tell me about some of the rooms that you're in, because I know this is just a little plug for Shannon's upcoming talk at the Best Friends National Conference. You will be speaking about one of the topics that you're passionate about, which is working in coalitions. So, whose rooms are you in? Who are you working with?
Yeah, so we are very active in the community as an organization. We are in communication with our legislators and lawmakers all of the time. They know me personally. And so really it's building those relationships. I also serve on an advisory board for our animal control here in Minneapolis. I've been in various different capacities with statewide coalitions, hoping to get another one started here in Minnesota. But yeah, again, it's just, finding those like-minded people that you can surround yourself with and hopefully make some change.
Why is it important to be around these like-minded people? What do you think you can get by working with them that you couldn't get doing this alone?
I mean, we can't do this work in silos, right? We pretend like we can, but really we need friends doing this work with us. The more voices that you have, the louder that voice becomes, and that's when that change can be made. And so that's where it's really important to, just have friends in this work with you that are willing to speak up.
So it sounds like, oh, so you just go meet a bunch of lawmakers and then you have an ordinance and you bring ASPCA and Best Friends with you to do it. But that feels like, okay, but what's your first step? So, back when you hadn't done this for 15 years and you were just learning how to build a coalition, how to work with lawmakers, how to do all of this, how to advocate for policy, what were some of the first steps that you'd take and how would you get started?
Yeah, first steps are data, right? You have to collect data, collecting those stories from people that are struggling to find places to live, stories from families that have had to surrender their pets because of lack of housing. A lot of shelters and rescues are collecting that information now of surrender reasons. And I think if we can streamline those reasons around housing, we can really tell a really powerful story. and hopefully get some things, passed on statewide, if not national levels. It's just, we have to collect that data. You have to tell the stories and collect stories, but also just make sure that you're present in the community, and starting to build those networks and those relationships.
To just show up, just start showing up at
Showing up.
meetings, just invite yourself to. Yeah.
You have to be annoying sometimes, right? You just have to be persistent. And if there's something that you're passionate about, whether it's housing or TNR or something else, right? You just have to keep showing up and using your voice.
I love that. Well, Shannon, let me just ask you one more thing. Your housing database is national. What would you say somebody on this call who wants to use it to help advocate in their community? How can they use that database and how can they contribute to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So our rental research dashboard, so it's different than our database, is really a one-stop shop for anything research-wise. So you can zoom into your state, you can see the percentages of dog-inclusive rentals versus non-inclusive. You can see trends, so whether it's how much does a pet fee, how many pets are allowed, those types of things. So that's really useful data. And if you're in an area where we don't have data yet, you can definitely reach out and we can help you get a project started. We are actually looking for a couple volunteers to join our housing team right now. We're going through a little bit of a transition, and I know those links will be dropped in the chat. And if you're interested in helping us out, we would love to have you. But then our database is more for people that are searching for a place to live. So you can type in your zip code and then it will populate the rentals that are in your area, and you can contact them and let them know that you found out about them on our website.
That's great. Thank you, Shannon.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Jamie, Jamie, you have what has to be one of the most, oh, wait, before I turn to Jamie, Shannon, somebody in the Q&A has asked if you can share a link to the ordinance that you're working on in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I will.
Thank you. Jamie, you have one of the coolest jobs in the country. You are the housing policy person for an animal organization. How did you get into that role?
Yes. So great question. I've been going through the community and across Massachusetts and meeting folks, I've been saying, it's not normally an intuitive thing to think of a housing policy specialist position at a sheltering animal welfare organization like MSPCA Angel. But leave it up to Massachusetts and MSPCA to really be forward thinking, thanks to some very generous donors who are really passionate about advocacy. They really made this position possible. I actually come from Corporation for Supportive Housing, where I was at for the last 7 years doing national training technical assistance on all things housing and homelessness. But on the side, I'm a local volunteer for local rescue and a foster home for the last 7 years. And so when the position became available here, I jumped on at the chance. I said, wow, this job sounds, absolutely amazing and really tailored for the skills that I was bringing to the table, and they felt the same way. So I came on board in September to design and lead our Action for Pet Inclusive Housing campaign, which is pretty broad. It spans the entirety of the housing sector, every facet you can think of. So from serving the needs of folks that are unhoused and experiencing homelessness through public housing, subsidized housing, into market rate housing, as well as looking internally across our shelter operations and our community outreach activities to see how can we move the needle around housing, how can we build new partnerships, engage existing coalitions around housing, and get some stuff done to increase the number of pet inclusive units in Massachusetts.
Because it really affects your organization, right?
Absolutely. One of the major reasons that they made the investment to add this capacity was because the data has been pretty daunting. We have a really solid data set stretching back several years that gives us really detailed information about where our surrenders are coming from. And so a full quarter of all of our surrenders coming in across our shelter networks are due to housing related barriers specifically. We've spent over $1 million in cost of care over the last 3 years. That number is only increasing, specifically just to care for the needs of the animals that have been surrendered due to housing, the majority of which are involuntary. surrenders, as Shannon was mentioning when she was speaking, right? That these are families that have no choice. We've had 500 cases of people entering homelessness for the first time, literal unhoused homelessness, so either into a shelter or remaining unhoused in tent encampments or living in their cars and having to surrender for those reasons. And so we have a pretty detailed understanding of what the housing barriers are. And through this campaign that we have launched and are enacting, we have specific strategies to try to address each facet of those housing barriers in a strategic way.
Well, one of those is paying off. You got some great news today. You want to talk about it?
Yeah, so a big part of Action for Pet Inclusive Housing is our legislative agenda. That's not the only thing that we are doing. We have a lot of work. Most of the work really is coming through our partnerships and our community outreach work. But on our legislative side, yes, we had a big win today. I just came from the Massachusetts State House where the Senate has taken up and is about to pass they may have already voted by now. I had to leave while the roll call was going, but the PETS Act, which we had been working on with our allies. So it's an act promoting pet equity, treatment, and safety. It has a bunch of provisions in there about our puppy mill agendas, our animal testing agenda, a bunch of stuff, but related to housing, two big pieces that they did inevitably take up, which is prohibiting insurance companies from underwriting or otherwise offering policies that have breed-specific discrimination in them. So prohibiting that practice, and then also expanding pet ownership across all 287 public housing authorities in Massachusetts. We have 287 separate authorities with 287 different pet policies. And the only residents of public housing now that are entitled by law to have pets are seniors. And so this would expand that into family public housing, both in state aided public housing, because unlike other states, Massachusetts has a state funded public housing program in addition to the federal one. So that is also a win. And so we're very excited about this, particularly for the insurance piece, because I'm sure, as everyone knows, that is the number one cited barrier by landlords when we are engaging as to why they cannot or will not adopt more pet inclusive policies within their housing. And so this is really going to supercharge the outreach and engagement that we're doing with large portfolio housing providers to really meaningfully engage them around their pet policies and what is a realistic barrier. So that will be removed. And yeah, we're very optimistic.
It's just fantastic. The insurance part is really exciting. The public housing part of it is too. 287 different public housing authorities. Do you have an estimate about how many units or how many renters we're talking about here?
So the largest one is, of course, the Boston Housing Authority. That's one of the largest public housing authorities in the nation. But there's a wide range. So Boston Housing Authority has tens of thousands of units, and then of course we have tiny little PHAs in like my town has maybe just a portfolio of a couple hundred units. But the important part is that it's parity across all of these policies. It's not up to the individual leadership of that individual PHA as to whether or not to allow someone with a pet. It will now be baked into the tenants' rights of all residents across Massachusetts in public housing. Now, of course, there's more work to do. Public housing is just one small segment of the housing sector. When we talk about housing broadly, I think a lot of folks tend to conflate sometimes. We say public housing and folks think that includes voucher holders and others, and it does not. So there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to expanding access to pet inclusive housing, but this is a big step forward.
Well, and a big part of this is that I feel like one of the silent sort of barriers for people who rent is not knowing what a pet policy is. So
Yes.
They're worried that they can't adopt a pet because they don't know if their landlord will allow it. And it's hard to find out what they allow and don't allow. So having this kind of uniformity and also having good kind of information about what it actually means will just mean that people feel confident that if they adopt this dog, they're actually going to get to live with this dog.
Exactly. And so another win that we're really that's incoming that we're really excited about that's separate from our legislative agenda and is more on our partnerships side is yeah, again, trying to connect people to that to the existing and available pet inclusive housing. Massachusetts has something called Housing Navigator, which is a statewide search engine for all state aided any income based or otherwise subsidized unit. So whether that's workforce housing or extremely low income, it doesn't matter, any sort of subsidized housing has to submit their information through this search portal. It was launched in 2021. We're one of only a very small number of states that has this sort of capacity to search all units in this way. And so we've launched a new effort with Housing Navigator to update their search filters and functions and to require additional information that isn't presently required around pet policy. So right now you can filter and it'll say pet friendly, but pet friendly could mean small mammals, it could mean hamsters. And so we're working with them to add additional categories so that way tenants and folks when they're searching for housing can really find that housing that is going to accept that 40, 50 pound plus dog without additional restrictions. And so that's fantastic. They were really enthusiastic when we approached them actually for this partnership. Their mission is all about connecting people with the housing that they need. And so any way we can remove barriers and connect people, they were so excited to work with us. And so we're really thrilled. Those changes are going to be rolled out on Housing Navigator, hopefully in early summer. And then the double bonus for that is that site also doubles as sort of the statewide data set for all affordable housing units. And so the unit counts. And so we'll be able to track the number of newly created pet inclusive or pet friendly units over time as our campaign proceeds.
I have so many questions for you that stem out of this. Let me ask you one and then not forget to ask you the next one. But one is when you're talking about tracking the number of units, this is part about, and you were talking about the numbers of surrenders. This is data. How do you use data in your advocacy? Why is it important? What kind of data do we need?
Data is absolutely essential. You cannot effectively advocate without it. You can't tell the stories. You can't attract the right partners that you need to get things done. Housing is complicated, right? It is not a monolith. There's different sets of stakeholders that you're going to need to work with depending on what type of housing we're talking about. So if we're talking about public housing, totally different set of set of folks that are invested than say market rate or mixed use where it's a mixture of low income and market rate or straight luxury housing. It just depends on who you're talking to. If I'm talking to homelessness advocates, and we are also presently working on getting more co-sheltering initiatives off the ground in Massachusetts. We only have 2 individual adult shelters that accept pets presently and 0 family shelters. So we're working on that. And they want to know what is our data showing around homelessness, which is why it's so important that our surrender data is as accurate as possible. And why I'm able to say confidently that we've had over 500 cases of people entering literal homelessness in the last 3 years. Those are really powerful numbers. Massachusetts is heavily invested in addressing the homelessness and housing crisis. And so when I bring these numbers to our homelessness continuums of care, that's that coalition that every community has that's dedicated to homelessness. It's called a continuum of care. They want to know this is the information that's going to get their attention. I might say other numbers like, oh, we've had, thousands of animals surrendered because of housing, but that's very generic and they might not necessarily think that applies to them because it's not homelessness specific. It might just be a workforce housing issue or it might be something else. And so being able to really zero in on how this is impacting and where that common ground is. How can you tailor this to make it fit the priorities of the coalition that you're engaging? So on the other side, for example, so that would be on the homelessness side, on just general housing production side, Massachusetts has a very aggressive housing production plan. They want to build 220,000 new units by 2035. Our priority is to make sure that some of those 220,000 new units will be pet inclusive. So we have really tailored our talking points for action and for pet inclusive housing to mirror the priorities of our governor's statewide housing production goals. We're saying, look, increasing access to pet inclusive housing is promoting equity, it's promoting fair housing, it's improving access, it's strengthening our workforce, and really getting them to understand where the intersection really lies. So sometimes I find myself talking more about workforce housing for certain demographics, which is also an issue we're seeing. That was one of the things that pushed MSPCA, in addition to the surrender data, was we run, one of the largest animal hospitals in the country, and it's very difficult for us to retain veterinary staff, recruit and retain because they cannot find housing in the greater Boston area, which is very expensive, that will allow them to bring their pets, which is affecting our hospital capacity and our ability to keep up that end of our mission. So it doesn't matter where you slice it. There's a message for whatever group of stakeholders we're talking to. And that all comes from the data.
So one of the things that I was hoping that you could share today, because most of the people who are on this webinar are not going to be in a position where they get to devote themselves full time to working on housing issues. But there are things that they can do. When you and I were talking before we got on today, you were telling me about some one-pagers that you've created to give to adopters, sharing just information about tenants' rights, about what happens if somebody tries to evict you and sort of the process and your rights and that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about sort of lower lift things that
Yes.
people can do that will be impactful?
Oh, absolutely. And I also created a one-pager to share with you all today from the webinar that sort of boils it down to some 8 practical steps that folks can take that with organizations that might have, as you say, a little less, they don't have a dedicated. Most folks aren't going to have a dedicated housing policy specialist or a position like we've been fortunate enough to be able to do. And so, but there are steps you can take with existing capacity and you can take big or small steps. And one of those things that we're doing is looking inward at the shelter to say, okay, we know, for example, 500 cases of people entering homelessness. They're coming into our shelter to have to surrender. We know a large chunk of them are involuntary. We also know that sometimes folks may still have to surrender because we have not yet built up capacity to co-shelter. So maybe the folks what are we doing to support the humans in addition to the animals that are being surrendered to our care? Do we have anything? In a way, it's almost unethical to ask about someone's housing status or reasons for surrender if we don't have something to give them in return. So we created some one-pagers that outline, where are all the individual homeless shelters and how to contact them in our local area. And it's tailored to all 5 of our different shelter locations. It has the contact information for that continuum of care, that coalition that I mentioned earlier. Every continuum of care in the United States is supposed to have what's called a coordinated entry system. That's that front door to your homeless response system in your community. What's the central number? What's the intake number for that? Where's the outreach person? Who do we contact? Make sure that the shelter staff have that information, just a baseline understanding. If there are pet-friendly shelters in your area, find out where they are, have a list of who they are, reach out to them, start to build some relationships with them and build bridges. A big part of what we're doing for Action for Pet Inclusive Housing is just building bridges between animal welfare and housing, which are traditionally very, very siloed areas of advocacy. And then, yes, an eviction prevention, a big one we get a lot of calls from the community about surrender because of eviction. My landlord is threatening me with eviction. I have to surrender. People are panicked. They're scared. They don't want to end up homeless. They're confused. And so really informing yourself, what is the state law? What is my state law on eviction? I can't speak to all 50 states, but I do know in Massachusetts, we have very, very strong tenant protection laws. The burden is on the landlord in our state, but that's not the same in every state. So really familiarize yourself with what the law says. There's a lot of really good resources that you can look up through various other nonprofit organizations in your community that have already done this work for you. There's guides, there's other things. But what we did is just boil it down to as simple as possible. What are the steps that your landlord has to take before they can legally evict you? And so that way you can talk folks through their options. They may not necessarily have to surrender today. You know, in Massachusetts, they have to give you a 30-day notice, for instance, and then there's a whole process that they have to go through. And if you do not want to surrender, your landlord can threaten and say, you have to be out next week. You don't get rid of these animals within 7 days, but that's not legally enforceable, and they can't do that. But it sounds really scary,
Hmm.
and can be used as a tactic. So how can we use the existing information to empower ourselves to try to assist folks who are sitting with us just by being informed about what the law says, where we are.
Yeah, so just putting together these sorts of information sheets for people
Yeah.
help keep these families together, and which is itself a way of increasing pet inclusive housing, that you don't have to leave your apartment today.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
If you are looking for options to keep your pet and you think that this is your only option, let's talk through what your options may be. You know, again, in Massachusetts, we have resources, and your state may too. Your city may too. It may have an eviction prevention program. That continuums of care often have things called prevention and diversion from homelessness. So if you're facing imminent homelessness because of threats of eviction or what have you, there might be resources available that you could refer folks that could have to avoid that surrender.
We got a question before our webinar started by email from somebody who wanted to know how government agencies can tie housing incentives to requirements for pet inclusive housing. For example, a requirement that a developer that takes any public financing will also allow pets with any breed and any size. What are your thoughts about that?
So I think that this is certainly, I think it's the future. It's been done successfully in California. And I believe also in Colorado. So I think there's at least two, but maybe Kathleen knows of a few more that I may have missed, but I know for sure. And then also in Nevada, they require supportive housing. So these are actions that states are taking to try to incentivize slash require housing developers that take state dollars to finance housing projects have to demonstrate that they're adopting pet inclusive policies. So we're starting to see a little bit of traction on that. We have not yet taken that approach here in Massachusetts, but it's certainly in the back of my mind for the future. I think it's a really creative way that we can try to do this, especially if your state is aggressively trying to tackle the housing crisis, because we're in a national housing crisis. There's not a single state in America that has enough housing on any scale of affordability, whether that's deeply affordable all the way up to market rate. We just don't have enough. And so if your state is aggressively trying to tackle that through a variety of housing production methods, there are ways that you can incentivize. Absolutely. So there's rules that govern how low income housing tax credit projects and how those are allocated. And there's like scoring rubrics for that and ways we incentivize green building and way we incentivize prioritizing people who have experienced homelessness or the creation of supportive housing, which is a form of housing that has services attached to subsidy. And there's ways we incentivize that. We can absolutely incentivize a pet inclusive policy by putting that in as part of the regulations or as part of that application requirement that they need to demonstrate uh, or submit their pet inclusive policy in order to be considered as part of this application. But there are formal processes to pursue that for every state. And of course, the feasibility is going to vary. In Colorado, they tried to do it by way of the qualified action plan. That's those guidelines, right? Where there's like this whole amendment process and you work with the housing finance agency. And they tried to do that and it didn't get, so they ended up passing legislation. And so it really depends on how the housing finance authority in that state or that city is going to want to play ball with you. If they're totally against it, then legislation may be the only pathway. But if you can find some natural allies and animal advocates within the housing finance agency, it might be less of a lift to get that across the finish line, depending on the stakeholders and the relationships that you have built there.
Well, that really ties together a whole bunch of things, right? It ties together if you don't succeed the first time you try, look for another opening, build these
Exactly.
relationships and don't do it alone and just keep your eye on the prize with this, right?
Absolutely. There's existing coalitions around housing that have been doing work for years and years and years, no matter where you've been, no matter where you are in the country. So finding that group of folks and finding out what their priorities are and seeing how your priorities intersect with those priorities is the fastest and most direct way to tap into the work that's already happening, right? What has seemed to work here in Massachusetts is saying, if we're serious about these 220,000 new units, if we're serious about tackling this severe housing crisis, we have a Venn diagram of families that have pets that are in need of housing. And we will not have the impact. That's what we've been saying to legislators and policymakers is we're not going to have the impact on these goals. We're not going to see the scale of impact that you are expecting out of these lofty housing goals if we ignore pet families, period. We will not have that impact. We will not see the success across our strategic housing goals. We ignore pet families at our peril. And that messaging seems to really be working.
This is great, Jamie. I could talk to you all day, but I have questions for Kathleen as
Yes.
well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Kathleen, you have been studying and examining housing policy issues across the country, looking for trends and looking for ideas, looking for model legislation. What are you seeing?
What's exciting is I'm seeing a lot of different combinations, and that's what I think we all understand is that there's not a one size fits all solution to the housing issue, to the pets and housing issue, and what that requires. And so, what's been interesting to kind of watch and see is legislation around pets and housing popping up not just in California, not just in Massachusetts, but everywhere in between. Like seeing pet inclusive legislation pop up in Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma. It tells you and it shows us that this is an issue that is facing everyone across the country because at the end of the day, pet inclusive housing is a housing stability issue, and it therefore is a community issue. Without housing stability, your community is not stable. And so what's exciting to see is some kind of smaller pieces of legislators. I would say I'm small but big impact, right? Small but mighty is just legislation and ordinances around the pet deposits and pet rent, right? Like that, I get excited about that because that seems to have just such immediate impact for individual pet owners, right? And so what do I mean by a pet deposit cap or something along those lines? It means that you cannot charge an exorbitant rate, something that is out of proportion with what your other rental deposits are. What is your other per unit deposit? And so we see a lot of that legislation. I think actually by far limits on pet rent and pet deposits is what I'm seeing the most nationally. And so that pet rent also, just an example, like what passed in DC recently is capping that at a certain percentage, capping that at how many months, and seeing that replicated across the country and introduced is exciting because when your pet rent is for each individual pet, and that adds up, right? And when your pet rent is more than your actual rent for the human paying the rent, it's just it's so out of proportion. So that's definitely the key trend is starting to see that legislation filed. Now it's not always passing, but as my friend said on here already, it takes years and building the faces and the stories and the numbers to show that. So that's a big one. We're also seeing a lot of these pet inclusive policies and trends doing away with breed restrictions, size restrictions, weight restrictions in that public housing sector. It does tend to be more in the public housing, government funded in some way or subsidized, affordable housing area, and it needs to get to market rate because we know that demand is there. We know that that's going to be driven by the market, but seeing it in the public housing is the first step. Also along those lines is doing away with the breed restrictions, weight restrictions, size restrictions in that private policy, in the private housing market, targeting HOA policies because so many times we see that the city doesn't have a ban or restrictions, but that HOA is able to take that next step. So taking, working to get those restrictions off the books is interesting to watch. And I know that's going on in Arizona right now. There's some active legislation about that. And then, as Shannon touched on, and Jamie, this transparency. A lot of times when people are looking for new housing, it's a short time window, right? There's so many different factors that they're having to weigh and getting out of one unit into a new unit. Um, Transparency around those policies, whether it be a rental situation or you're purchasing a home, you're getting through your due diligence and you find out that the HOA has a restriction. Those transparency requirements at the beginning is a big deal. Finding that out so you can move on to your other choices or you don't miss out on an opportunity is huge. So transparency is another game changer for making sure that people know upfront what they are going to be getting into so they don't waste time and aren't faced with a last minute situation where they have to give up their pet and their family member. So really those are kind of the main trends that we're seeing across the country. And like I said, it's exciting because it's not just in one or two states. We're seeing multiple states have them and multiple pieces of legislation going after these issues. And really, when you see that, it starts to hit the tipping point that legislation becomes more successful. The more frequent it comes up, then you know more people are talking about it and it's getting in front of legislators more. And they really start to pay attention that way.
Yeah, it's very powerful to be able to go and say to them, 17 other states already have this, 16 other cities already have this. Like, why are we waiting?
Right.
Let's not be last.
Exactly. And that's where the data comes in is so helpful. Yes, you want to have your localized data. That's always important to your elected officials at the state and local level. They want to know how is it affecting our actual community? Is it really a problem here in our community? So you've got to have that local data, but also having that national data to show that we aren't the only ones. We're not the only ones facing this problem. And so then you can say, we're not the only ones. Let's replicate what they've done elsewhere and what's working. And that makes it a more powerful story too.
Um, One of the things that you and I have, well, actually, let me ask you something else first, because one of the things I love about this transparency piece is laws requiring transparency would be great, but that's something also where building relationships can sort of fill that gap in the meantime, right? Like until you get this law passed, you as a community engagement person at your organization, as whoever at your organization, you can develop these relationships with landlords and ask them to be more transparent in the meantime, to put this information on their website, right?
Yes, you should ask them. And that's where the great intersect of other coalition building and getting with other organizations that are supporting tenant rights or affordable housing, who care about kind of the wraparound social services and social justice issues, because it's not just the transparency on the pet issues, pet fees, pet deposits, but it's all the fees, right? If a landlord is not being transparent about their pet policy, then it's likely that there's some other policies that the tenants are not aware of either. And that's where you can partner in coalition with other organizations to say, let's challenge these landlords to be transparent across the board. And you're going to have the strength in numbers there and more success in saying, let's be transparent about everything and ask those landlords to do that. And maybe it's even the way that Shannon's organization has a listing of pet friendly and pet inclusive listings is you say, you get our seal of approval, you get our check mark, we'll help publicize your policies, the carrot and stick kind of situation of what's in it for them and what's in it for you. That nexus is what will help you be successful in our quest to get this transparency really there.
You come to this not just as a policy analyst or a policy expert, you also come to this as somebody who has experience with people coming to you and saying, please pass this law, please draft this law, here's why it's important to me. What would what would persuade you when you were on the council in Nashville? If somebody wanted you to pass, say, a cap on pet fees, what would have persuaded you to get on board with that, to champion it?
It's definitely the stories and the statistics. And to be very honest with you, elected officials hear more from homeowners. They don't hear as much from renters because renters are more transient. Renters might not be as engaged in the community area. And the homeowners who are there longer are more likely to have that relationship with elected officials. And so being able to bring the data and statistics to show that it is when you have pet friendly and pet inclusive policies, not just landlord by landlord, but citywide, that brings more stability to your community and that brings more stability to your neighborhoods. And it increases the quality of life for everyone, tenants, renters, homeowners alike. That's extremely compelling to an elected official who may be up for reelection, who may be, fighting another big policy. But getting those stories and that data of how it affects all the issues in the district is so important. So tying it to the quality of life, tying it to how expensive your shelter budget and costs are, the fact that this instability costs your shelter more money. That's money that could go to a different project that they care about in their community. So you've got to tailor it to the individual elected official, of course, but showing them how this is across the board a community issue is very important and compelling to your elected officials.
Does it help to bring somebody with you if you're going to a meeting in their office? Does it help to bring somebody with you who's been affected by this, who had to give up their pet because
Yes,
they couldn't find a place to live?
yes, because all of these can be hypotheticals. We can all come up with, well, this happened to my cousin, and it happened to a neighbor down the street. But an elected official sitting there eye to eye with someone who this has happened to, who has lost their family pet, their family member has been separated from them, and hearing about that firsthand and that emotion, that is just as strong as knowing about the fiscal impact, the statistical turnover in tenants, the cost to renew a lease or to move to a new unit. Those numbers are so important, but being able to make that human connection as well is it's a lot harder to say no to a person who has faced and experienced this type of separation and instability, than it is to just a story on a piece of paper or an email.
What are some best friends resources that we can offer to people who want to get advocating on housing issues?
Yeah, so we also have some one-sheeters on various shelter issues, and one that we always love to push is oh, now I'm going to get the name wrong. It's on my desktop, but it's the high price of status quo. And I think that's just such a great title for a lot of things that we've talked about today. But we are able to offer ordinance reviews. So if your community has had a stale policy in place, that may be something that we can offer you, is reviewing that and making suggestions of best practices. We also, if you have a movement happening or starting in your community that you're interested in, is using our platform to help to open a petition for people to say that they support what you are offering. And that is through our action team as well. So if you don't have an action team, starting an action team or starting that petition. I don't know how much of this is out there yet, but we are going to be doing some one-on-one coaching, which you can always email us in your situation and see if we have someone who can help you through your regional team or through our advocacy team. And then we also have a new ambassador program. So if you have a great community advocate in your area, please suggest them to us, and we'd love to help coach them through our new ambassador program so they can help advocate alongside you.
Where can people find out about the advocate program?
I believe it's on our website. I'm not sure if we can get the link dropped in now, but if not, I'm sure we can send it out afterwards about how to nominate someone for our ambassador program.
This is great. All three of you, a few questions have come in through the chat. One is somebody who's wondering if, in addition to breed and weight restrictions, you know of any laws or ordinances that prohibit landlords from requiring cats to be declawed. Is that something that's happening?
We did a statewide law here in Minnesota to prohibit declawing and devocalization. That's also something that can happen. So devocalizing dogs in apartments. And I'm trying to remember if it passed, and I will have to double check that. But I know it's a conversation that we've had on a state level for sure.
Do either of you know of any specific law, Jamie or Kathleen? Do you know of anything that has become law about prohibiting landlords from requiring cats to be declawed? No. Okay, well, we're going to have to look into that. That was a great question.
It did pass.
Oh, it did pass.
Actually, it goes into effect this month here in Minneapolis or across
That's great news.
Minnesota. So no declawing and no devocalization can be required by landlords across the state of Minnesota.
I mean,
Look
for what
at
it's
this.
worth, we have not seen any instances of that being required in Massachusetts or in New England anywhere
Okay.
in the course of our research.
Well, that's a good plug for New England too. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that the bill passed and that it's not needed in New England. Um, okay, we got another question asking about liaison advocates designated from prosecuting attorneys' offices or from a city, county council. Do any of you know what anything about this?
I know some district attorneys, their offices will have one ADA or kind of coordinator who will address animal all animal cases that come in. That prosecutor or that advocate in their office will kind of help coordinate that. So I'm wondering that maybe, I don't know of any kind of formalized policy, but maybe looking through the Attorney General's conferences per state would have some more information about that.
We do something similar to that, but I don't want to speak out of turn about what we do. But MSPCA has a unique role in how we work with law enforcement and the animal officers in each state. They go through our training first. It's an interesting model. So we're deeply involved and in all prosecutions of animal cruelty cases in Massachusetts. So I wonder if that speaks to it or not. And I'm happy to find more answers for folks from our designated staff attorney who handles all those. If people are really curious about it, happy to put folks in touch with her.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, so let me throw this to all three of you. What do you think people aren't talking about when it comes to housing that we should be talking about? What's kind of going under the radar but is important and makes a difference? Not to put you on the spot.
I would say it's a really good reminder that pets are political. So housing policy, any policy that's going to impact people will impact pets. And it's just something that we need to remember as we work forward.
I frequently say that, I think everyone knows that we're in a housing crisis generally, and that housing affordability is off the charts. But I think people are really not examining closely enough the fact that we're in this perfect storm where folks are opting more into pets, they're opting less into having children. The demographics of folks that are making those choices are also, on top of that, shut out of opportunities for home ownership and are increasingly perma renters in every community that they go to. And as such, as renters and consumers on the housing market, their demands and their needs are shifting. And if you watch anything around, market research around housing, you'll see that pet-related amenities, all the demands for that's going up, up, up. Every consumer, every rental survey says that. And yet we're not seeing the market shift in kind. And we really need to have those conversations with developers and others and folks that are, housing advocates I'm speaking to, they care when you bring it up. They want to fix the housing crisis, but even the housing sector isn't thinking about pet families. Even the really dedicated, caring folks that I worked with in housing for the last 8 years, it just doesn't rise to the level of attention until you bring it up. So if we don't speak up on behalf of pet families, nobody else is. Nobody else is. And so it's so needed. It's so needed to say, if we want to tackle the housing crisis, we have to include considerations for pet families because things are fundamentally shifting in our society.
I agree. And I think also just bringing the attention of the statistics of the kind of like housing instability pipeline to shelter intake, that direct correlation, that direct causation correlation, both of them, you can't argue with those numbers. And so even if you don't know the right solution or the right answer in your community, just bringing that to the attention of elected officials and decision makers, bringing that to the forefront, be it through the numbers, translated to the costs, that fiscal number, it makes an impact. And so I think just bringing up the information over and over again until we find the right solution or the combination of right solutions in your community, it's key. Don't stop talking about it. Continue to bring up housing pipeline to shelters.
So get to know people and keep bringing this issue to the fore. Just make sure it doesn't get forgotten.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, with 2 minutes left, let me ask you an easy question. Is this a problem that we're going to solve?
We can solve it. It's going to take a lot of solutions. It takes a lot of conversations, a lot of coalitions. But I think that, you know, when the housing solutions work for the whole family, then housing works for that whole community. And that's important.
I feel very optimistic. I think we know exactly the pathway on how to get these things done and who makes these decisions and who we need. We just need to be having those conversations and getting into the room with with the existing advocates and the existing work to speak up on behalf of pet families. But it absolutely can be done.
Yeah, I would agree. Everyone who's on this webinar, everyone who's going to watch the recording, it's going to take all of us having these conversations. And if we do want to solve this problem, like, we need you to get active as well.
Well, that's great. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here on the webinar. Thank you for sharing your experience and your insights. And thank you to everybody who came today. We really appreciate you being here, and we really appreciate you tackling this issue.
Thank you so much for having us.